Welcome back to the Evermore in Our YouTube channel, the home of album reviews, discography guides and think pieces. So today's review is a review of the brand new Gorillaz album called Cracker Island. Now, Gorillaz, one of the biggest names in the pop scene, masterminded by Blur frontman Damon Albarn, cartoonist Jamie Hewlett, and recently joined forces with Remy Kabaka Jr. as well, and released a trilogy of fantastic albums in the 2000s, starting with the self-titled Gorillaz album, then Demon Days, and then my personal favourite, Plastic Beach. But since then, basically every single one of their releases can basically be summed up by the word meh, and that's about it. Although they did have a comeback with 2020's Song Machine Season 1, which I thought was easily one of the best albums of 2020, showed Gorillaz back on their game, perfect songwriting, great utilisation of guests, brilliant, colourful, cartoony sounds. It was all back. After what could be considered quite a long creative rut, the guys really came back with their best album since Plastic Beach quite handily, in my opinion. So I could only think that on this new album, they would try to continue that momentum, joining forces with pop producer Greg Kurstin on this one. I was excited to see what they'd kind of dig up as far as ideas were concerned. Although, of course, given that Song Machine was a very kind of it was a very consequential endeavour, music videos and a lot of conceptual stuff and tons of guests, whereas this one is relatively pared back, only 10 tracks this time around, not as many guests, and it kind of gave me flashbacks to, think about it, right? The best projects that Gorillaz have done are normally, they've got quite a few guests on them. I'm thinking mostly about Plastic Beach here, right? Plastic Beach, ton of guests on it, a load of conceptual stuff, loads of artwork, the live shows were really extravagant, but then the lesser albums like The Fall or The Now Now, they were very much just band playing songs on an album, and that just feels like what this album is. This album feels a lot more plain in comparison to something like Song Machine or Plastic Beach. So I was kind of worried that maybe with a return to a more kind of back to basics approach that some of that flair from the music would disappear, but of course I hope that wouldn't be the case. So after a good few listens, here's what I thought of Gorillaz' brand new album Cracker Island. The opener, lead single and title track is Cracker Island, and I feel like this track is everything you could have wanted from an opening Gorillaz track, because it's just it shows Gorillaz' prowess at writing brilliant pop songs, as well as their utilisation of guests as well, and basically it shows all of their skills operating at top form. So not only is the instrumental here great, I think it's a nice mix of new and retro here. It's kind of a future disco take, if you like a really nice chunky danceable beat, some nice additions of percussion, some very catchy synth lines going throughout here, of course, some very cool funky guitar as well. Thundercat, the guest on the track, I believe, provides the bass on here, which of course, knowing Thundercat, is fantastic. This whole track sonically just sounds very fun, and that's exactly what you want from a Gorillaz track. Just fun pop tracks, but with kind of a sort of eccentric individual flair to them, which is definitely what you get here. And I think vocally, Damon or 2D's vocals kind of have that thing that they always do, where they are simultaneously very characterful, very animated, but also very laid back, while still being very melodic, which I think is something that is mastered on this track, because it is a very laid back, almost kind of deadpan delivery from Damon here. But I think the catchiness of the track still translates. It still translates despite being such a deadpan performance. And I also think that having that kind of I suppose apathetic delivery does kind of add to some of the character of the track as well, in a way. And I feel like as well as Thundercat providing some excellent backing vocals here, which sound fantastic, especially some of the grouped harmony sounding ones, I feel like the lyrics are also pretty good here, because it starts off the album's themes of things like cults and false information and stuff like that, and I'm glad that it wasn't done as ham-fisted as nearly as it could have been. That's not a proper sentence, but basically Damon said in an interview, I'll see if I can try find a screenshot of it, that basically Cracker Island is like a place where no one believes in truths and it's all fake, and he said the phrase, they probably watch Fox News on Cracker Island, which to me just feels like, political satire for the sake of political satire. But I feel like if that kind of attitude was transplanted onto the lyrics, it would come across very kind of ham-fisted and just kind of a bit like, oh, you probably could have done this a bit better. But thankfully, the lyrics on here are a little more kind of tactful and deliberate in their approach, rather than just being like lol Fox News, which I'm glad about. I think you can tell. So yeah, I think this track is really good. I think instrumentally it's very peppy, very colourful, very animated. Vocally, despite being deadpan, it's still incredibly catchy. Some brilliant contributions from Thundercat as well. Lyrics that are done not nearly as badly as they could have been done, and as far as the concept is concerned, are actually pulled off quite well. It's a good opener. The next track is Oil featuring Stevie Nicks, and was probably the track on this album that I was the most excited for, just based on the names involved. And does it deliver? I think so. I think this is another great track, because I feel like overall it just has a really nice, catchy, infectious vibe. Again, a very nice use of a disco beat here, some nice ethereal synthesizers that are kind of simultaneously whirring but also very bright at points, some nice guitars as well. I feel like the additions of some darker synths, particularly along the second verse portion, add like a nice tension and a slightly forlorn vibe. I think the keys and the chimes in the chorus are quite effective as well. The brighter sections of both the bridge and the outro work nicely. So yeah, basically just instrumentally, this track's fantastic. Like really danceable, really catchy, really colourful, slightly forlorn in places, but it all works really, really well, in my opinion, to again craft another great pop song. But of course, the real stars of the show here are the vocals, because not only does Damon give a great performance, again catchy, infectious, but also quite laid back, while still being quite characterful, quite emotional as well. You can definitely hear the emotion coming through a bit more on here than you could on Cracker Island, and I think it works to his benefit. But so not only is Damon holding down the fort really well here, but Stevie Nicks' contributions are of course fantastic. I mean, granted, it is more of a background vocal, and so I can see merit to the argument that like for a Stevie Nicks feature you might want something a bit more substantial, but for me I think it works. I feel like her more solo sections where her vocals are the focal point work really, really well, because she has a kind of I don't know what the word is, like a very authoritative singing style while still being incredibly melodic, which I think works really, really well. And I think that when her and Damon duet on the chorus sections, it sounds absolutely brilliant. I think their voices work really, really well together, and it has this, again, it gives the track a really kind of catchy, colourful, bright aura that it plays with very, very well, while also, again, having Stevie Nicks' vocals add that just tinge of melancholy to proceedings that I think is all like it works really well, is what I'm trying to say. And I think the lyrics that seem to be about kind of social media and escapism, as well as moving on from relationships, they could again be done a lot worse. And that's it. That is going to be a running theme for a lot of the lyrics on this album, is that they tackle themes that when done wrong sound horrific in lyrical form, but here they managed to actually balance it quite well. It doesn't sound ham-fisted, it doesn't sound like, oh well, 1984, we're gonna die, you know, it's not that kind of like doom-mongering bollocks that you get from some albums like this. I feel like they tackle the subject matter in quite a tactful, quite human way, which I think again works to its benefit. So again, musically, lyrically, conceptually, you know, the utilization of guests is there as it was with the opening track. This is just yet another really strong one for basically all the same reasons. Track number 3 is called The Tired Influencer, and is another one of my favourite ones on the album, albeit for slightly different reasons this time around, but I still think it goes over fairly well. So I do really like the very ethereal, very dreamy vibe that this track has going for it, like a nice bustling beat, some cool additions of things like glockenspiels, or like these weird floaty kind of dreamy piano passages, Hawaiian guitars, Siri voices. Like, it all sounds very, very weird and a bit like a hodgepodge, but having it all come together, it really does create again a very dreamy, very otherworldly vibe that the track plays with very, very well. I think this is particularly evident in the chorus, where the synth layers ideas really come together and give it this very bright sheen, which sounds really, really nice. I think vocally, Damon again delivers a very earnest, very emotional performance that is, again, kind of more soul-bearing than I think any other track so far. Granted, there's only been 2, or it sounds more kind of fragile on here, which I think is the vibe they were going for based on the lyrical sentiment, which I'll get to in a minute. And so for that reason, I think is all the more effective because of it. And such a performance also anchors some really catchy melodies and some very nice harmonies, particularly on the chorus, which again, I think melodically this track is very, very strong, like not only in the instrumentation, like with the synths and stuff, but also again the vocal harmonies, the vocal melodies throughout. It's very, very again, otherworldly and ethereal seem to be the words that I'm coming back to. Not only that, but also incredibly catchy at the same time as well. And lyrically, I'll admit it yet again, right? Lyrics like this could be absolutely horrific, right? Like, just out of the way, straight out of the gate, the word influencer makes me want to die. I hate it so much. But I feel like the general lyrical sentiment of kind of a content creator searching for meaning in a kind of meaningless, hyper-real world, again, sounds quite cringy and dystopian, and yeah, maybe some of the, like, phraseology, like, kind of living in a cracked screen world is a little bit on the nose, but when you like look back and kind of think like, oh, you know, they're trying to do a dystopian technology ruining our lives kind of hyper-real thing, this could have been so much worse. I mean, you just have to look at like certain like rock bands who are doing like, you know, dystopian, the world is ending kind of shit, and then, you know, this looks a million times better by comparison. And as well as that, I actually think having a dreamy instrumental on top of these lyrics, or rather having the lyrics on top of the instrumental, helps to kind of drive home the feeling of kind of desperation and dystopia even better, because it's kind of this very floaty, very airy kind of instrumental, but with these really kind of you know, desperate lyrics. Is quite an interesting compliment. There are the most minor of minor quibbles with this track, but I think it is yet again a brilliant pop track for Gorillaz. Bit more ethereal this time around, bit more emotional maybe, bit less kind of bombastic and colourful, but still very, very successful. The fourth track is the 5th single called Silent Running, featuring Adele Omatayo. I apologise if I've butchered your name there, my friend, but this whole track has a very nocturnal kind of disco synth pop thing going on, and I think it works quite well. Like, again, another very hefty, substantial disco influenced beat here, some nice subtle funk influenced guitars, nice washes of 80s synthesizer, some very nice deep, thick bass. I keep using the word nice, I need to stop doing that. But the point being, the instrumental works very, very well, despite being part of a genre that over the last few years has been very oversaturated. I actually think Gorillaz pull this off fairly well, and I also think that the grand piano progressions that go throughout the track at points also help to give it an air of melancholy, which fits with the vocals, because Damon delivers, again, a very fragile, very emotional, very vulnerable vocal performance, while still being very catchy, very infectious, very effective. Again, like basically every single vocal performance he's had on this album so far, and it works, of course, very, very well. And I think the guest contributions from Adele also work very well, him giving it a more dramatic flourish, shall we say, on both the backing vocals, particularly evident on the very atmospheric bridge, in which I think he also does a very, very good job indeed. So I feel like the instrumental works very well and the vocals complement it very well, and yet again it tackles a lyrical sentiment rather that could be done horrifically, but is actually done fairly decently, I would say, because as well as kind of leaning into the ideas of things like relationships, and I suppose by extension the album's general themes of things like cult dynamics, it also goes into things like the destructive, all-consuming nature of social media addiction and things like that. And again, it could have been done so much worse, like, you know, calling like, oh, the phones are the prison cells, you know, all this. They could have gone that way. Thank God they didn't, because that would have been horrific. But again, I feel like it's approached with a tact that is very, very, very welcomed, I would say. I would say as well that it's kind of approaching these issues as kind of like technology and the modern world and what have you, with kind of a similar tact that Plastic Beach approached its environmental concerns. Maybe some of the imagery on this album is a little more on the nose, but I feel like it's certainly, again, it is nowhere near as tactless or as kind of, tacky as it could have been. And so I think, yet again, it works very well. Like, again, a very nocturnal, very kind of melancholy track here, but still one that's very catchy, very well written, and all, for all intents and purposes, quite colourful all the same.
Feel like I've been silent running through the infinite pages and scroll out searching.
The track at the halfway point is called New Gold, featuring Tame Impala and Booty Brown, and I actually think that this one is, again, quite a good one, although there are a few minor quibbles here or there, maybe more so than previous tracks, because I do very much like the sound palette of this track. I think it's very summery, very shiny, some of which I think is actually to do with the contributions of Tame Impala, which I suppose that is kind of their sonic MO, if you like, and so I think it works quite well here. I think it's quite a summery, shiny, very kaleidoscopic hip-hop cut. Again, another kind of disco-influenced beat here, some nice washes of synthesizers, some nice guitars as well, some almost G-funk style synth leads. It all works very, very well in terms of the sonic palette of the track, and I think in general the very colourful sound of this whole album is done very, very well, with a more kind of, again, maybe kind of, is it East Coast? I'm not good with geography, but that very kind of bright, summery vibe that kind of, it's like a Sunset Boulevard kind of thing going on. I think it works very nicely, although the vocals are a bit hit and miss, because while I do like the contributions of Tame Impala's Kevin Parker, who kind of delivered his trademark kind of airy croon over these nice washes of synthesizers in the chorus, and I also think that Damon holds down the fort pretty well with a nice performance on the bridge, quite emotional but also very catchy yet again, although I wish he did do a bit more. It kind of reminds me of some of the stuff off of like Humanz maybe, where the features did like a lot of the heavy lifting and then Damon just kind of had like a few lines on the bridge. Granted, there are tracks where that can work, like, a perfect example would be maybe Friday the 13th featuring Octavian from the Song Machine album. Damon only had like one line repeated like 8 times on the bridge of that song, and yet I think his contributions there are fantastic, whereas here they just feel quite inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. But I think for a lot of Gorillaz fans, the main selling point of this track would be rapper Booty Brown, who previously had a great performance on the Gorillaz single Dirty Harry from the Demon Days album, one of Gorillaz' best tracks in one's humble opinion. So of course you're thinking, he's back after like 18 years, great, let's go, let's do it. I mean, some of it is good. I feel like he has a very confident, very laid back flow, which is nice, and I feel like some of the lyrics are also done fairly well. Again, it's that thing of taking a concept like the kind of pitfalls of modern society and kind of weaving them into a rap verse in quite a maybe it is a bit more bash you over the head with it this time, because mainly some of the imagery is just like way too weird for me to really get my head around. Like, I get what it's trying to do, but some of the imagery just doesn't really, like, liposuction scheduled for granny. I mean, Sean, he's a rider, very nice line, I like that one, but it's just like, some of the imagery, like, again, liposuction for granny, watch out for the cult's Paul Revere, and he makes like some Pauly Shore reference, I think. Like, I've got, maybe it's just because I don't know what these things are, and so I don't really know what he's talking about, but it just seems like there's a lot of very weird imagery and references in this track that just makes it feel kind of odd. And I feel like the transition between Booty's verses and the chorus are kind of odd. Maybe it's like a time signature thing, but they just seem to kind of really bulldoze into each other, particularly the chorus, where Kevin Parker's hook seems to almost like cut off Booty Brown's verses, which sounds kind of odd. Although I do admit, I do like Booty's song delivery in the bridge of the track. I do think that goes over quite well. So I do have a few complaints. Maybe it's with some of the structural things, mostly with the lyrics, maybe some of the, you know, so it's not a perfect track, but I'd say it still goes over fairly well. Like it has a nice summery sound to it, very peppy beat, some decent vocal performances all round, I would say, just like a few quibbles with things like the lyrics or the structure here or there. The next track is called Baby Queen and was, I believe, the third single from this album, and it kind of feels to me like a bit of a stylistic throwback to maybe the Plastic Beach days, like a very slow but still quite funky hip-hop beat, kind of laden with a lot of atmospheres, pianos, strings. It gives it a very heavenly effect, very nice effect, all sounds really cool, especially the layers of synths on this track I think are particularly good, especially in the chorus, and the way they pair with the very slow, deliberate beat is quite nice as well. And I feel, I'm saying stylistically, think maybe, I don't know, maybe Lost Chord from Song Machine mixed with like Melancholy Hill or something. Like, it's that kind of vibe, and I think it works very well for them here. And I also think that Damon's vocals, yet again, have that very kind of forlorn, quite dreary, melancholic vibe to them, but still with a strong sense of melody to them. Again, particularly on the chorus, where that more forlorn element to it really comes to prominence with an almost kind of strained delivery of the refrain, which I actually think is quite captivating. And I feel like in general the more kind of palpable emotion that you can feel in his voice, whether it's kind of, you know, the straining on the refrain or the general more kind of subdued kind of melancholic delivery throughout, it's definitely more palpable here, and I think works very, very well to create, again, this sense of vulnerability that the track plays with very, very well. The only thing I would say is that the lyrics, while conceptually pretty cool, in practice are a little kind of yeah. And let me explain, right? So the song is apparently about how in, I think it was 1997, the princess of Thailand went to go visit Blur when they were recording, and it turns out that she was like a massive Blur fan, and they all had like a really great time on that holiday, what have you. Yeah, it's all, yeah, like it's nice. And then, you know, Damon kind of had a dream about meeting up with her when she was an adult and kind of, you know, hanging out and like, you know, kind of reminiscing about old times and kind of being like, wow, you know, time passes fast, you know. And that's all well and good. It seems like a fairly earnest lyrical sentiment. Only thing is that when you put it into lyrical form, like lyrics like Baby Queen, you grew up in my dreams. I mean, I hate to be that guy, right? But it sounds a bit pedo-y, right? That's all I'm going to say. Like, I refuse to believe that nobody read these lyrics and didn't kind of, you know, give it like a little bit kind of a, what? Sorry? Like, you know, I'm thinking you might want to fix some of the phrasing before, because like I say, the lyrical sentiment itself is fine, the music is great, the vocals are very solid, but I just feel like you maybe should have looked over some of the phrasing to kind of, you know, shall we say, mitigate any possible skepticisms, because some of it does sound a little bit weird. But I think it's the only song I can remember where I had to Google what the lyrics were about to make sure that this wasn't like some weird thing going on, and that's something that you definitely want to avoid. So while I definitely enjoyed this track vocally and musically, lyrically, while the, you know, the earnesty and the subject matter was there, some of the phrasing could have done with a bit of work, it's fair to say. Track number 7 is Tarantula, and I will say, right, every single track on this album so far, musically, has been basically flawless in my opinion. Like, maybe some shine slightly brighter than others, but like mostly musically, it's been fairly solid all the way through. So I was kind of going into this song thinking like, you know, I might have to end up giving this album like an 8 or a 9 out of 10. Like, this is great. Like, you know, I hope they keep up the streak. And then the melodies that pop in on the intro of this song are so like goofy that I almost had to like double take it, because there's a difference between the colourful melodies and stuff on tracks like Oil or New Gold, whereas these are just like bright and shimmery to the point of being like goofy, like the steel drums, you know, the like weird plinky plucky noises, like the plinky plonky pianos, the weird, like, you know, there's just so many like odd, like bubbly kind of like it just feels really goofy. Like the steel drums on top of the plinky pianos, on top of the weird like plonky, weird pluck sounds. It just all sounds so weird. Although, that being said, I do like the disco beat on here with the funky guitars. I think it sounds rather nice. Some cool atmospheres here. The synth stabs on the second verse, I suppose, are nice too. And I guess when the two of those things kind of coalesce with each other in the latter choruses, they don't sound too bad, although again, the goofier elements of the instrumental on this track really do stick out like a sore thumb wherever you go. And I also feel like vocally it's decent, you know, like Damon's earnesty and his emotion is still there, and I feel like the chorus and the bridge are still fairly killer in terms of catchiness, as is the refrain. But I will say that it isn't nearly as catchy or as kind of ear-grabbing. It just doesn't hit as hard. Like, there's just not that strength of performance. There's not that real kind of confidence in the delivery. I get that there's been forlorn and like melancholic deliveries before, but he delivered them with some gusto, whereas here it just feels quite flat. And granted, the lyrics about kind of yearning for a relationship despite not being at your best point, maybe mentally or physically, they're quite nicely done, I think. And I think again, the earnesty of that very much translates. But again, the vocals just feel really flat in comparison to a lot of the other more kind of relationship melancholy tracks here, and so it just doesn't end up leaving as much of an impression. Combine that with the fact that although I do like some elements of the beat, some of it were just so goofy to the point where they were almost laughable, and this is definitely my least favourite, at least so far. The next track is Tormentor featuring Bad Bunny. Yes, Gorillaz have teamed up with the most streamed artist on Spotify for the last 3 or 4 years running at this point, and well, is it a good track, I think is the main question that we're all thinking based on the names involved. There are positives, I won't lie, there are some positives here. I do like the very summery vibe of the track generally. I think that the kind of cutesy marimba sounds and some of the percussion works quite nicely. I like the additions of harp as well. The washes of synthesizers throughout work quite well. I feel like the electric pianos also have quite a nice effect to them. It's just quite a nice, chill, summery jam with some nice synthesizers, laid back percussion, some nice electric pianos as well, as I say, although the sudden kind of transition or even cut to electric pianos in the outro, that kind of like extended passage, does feel very, very jarring. Like the chorus is just going on, and I think they cut Damon out mid-word to just like hard transition to this electronic piano passage in a way that I don't think really does the track any favours, because it doesn't really add anything, doesn't take much away, granted, but it, again, it doesn't really add much of anything, and the transition feels very jarring. But I feel like for the most part, instrumentally, I quite liked it. And I also feel like Bad Bunny, if he sounds very confident over this kind of delivery because it's his vibe, and I'm not normally a fan of reggaeton music generally, but I feel like this one is done fairly well. I suppose there is a bit more of a kind of colourful, almost cutesy, more Gorillaz vibe to it, if you like, which I think works quite well. And again, Bad Bunny, I think, sounds very confident, and his lyrics about kind of, the oasis of a relationship in a very chaotic world, they're done fairly well. And I also feel like Damon's auto-tuned chorus backing vocals are also quite effective, because as blatant as the effect might be, and as kind of warbly and cheap sounding as the effect might be, I do think it adds more to the quaint charm of the track. And so I think that aesthetically this was actually quite a nice choice. Although the one thing I would say, like with the last track, I just don't think Bad Bunny, in terms of all the other features we've had so far on this album, Booty Brown, Tame Impala, Stevie Nicks, Thundercat, all of these people, he doesn't really stick out as much as the other features do. Like he doesn't leave his mark on the track as much as the other features do. He's there and he has a decent vocal performance, sure, and his lyrics are nice, but it just, it doesn't quite have that like, wow, he really bought it to this feature. Like, yeah, it's a good feature, but like it's just kind of good in a very kind of non-specific way, if you know what I mean. So like there are positives to this track for sure. I feel like it's definitely one of the more enjoyable, less generic reggaeton songs I've heard. It's got quite a quaint, again quite cutesy vibe. I feel like the lyrics and the vocals are kind of solid. I think Damon's contributions, though more minimal, do work quite nicely. I feel like it's just another case, like with the last track, where just, you know, because everything so far has been so strong, this one might be good, but like it's not really much else other than good, you know, if you know what I mean. Like it's good in a very, very unremarkable way. Like there are things that I like, but it's not like I'm, you know, like recoiling back in my chair like, oh my god, you know. It's just like good in a very, very plain way, I suppose is the way that I would put it. The penultimate track is called Skinny Ape and is arguably the most multifaceted track on this whole album, both musically and lyrically, because musically it covers so much ground that it's unbelievable. Like from the country-esque guitars and the vocal harmonies in the intro to the very kind of glitchy, electronic, textured, kind of semi-hip-hop psychedelic thing going on in the verses with the kind of nice chimey synthesizers and odd bustling chunky beats, to the kind of very dream pop-esque choruses. And if all that wasn't enough, parts of this track are kind of supplemented by these really fast-paced breakneck dance sections that are just absolutely raging, like walls of pulsing synthesizers just going and going and going and going. This beat going at absolute breakneck pace. It is an absolute dance rager. So yeah, there's so much ground covered here, but it all somehow manages to sound cohesive at the end of it, which is really quite an achievement, to be honest. And I feel like lyrically this is maybe the most self-aware set of lyrics I've ever heard penned from a Gorillaz track. Like lyrics on a refrain like, don't be sad for me, I'm a cartoon G, my intent is to breed in a new world. Like, you know, it's very clear like Damon's kind of playing with quite a meta subject matter on here, but I think it actually works fairly well, as does his vocal performance, which can kind of, you know, go from very quaint in the kind of intro with the guitars to quite confident, almost blunt I suppose would maybe be the word, although not quite that, in the verses, to the very melodic choruses and the kind of very kind of frenzied kind of ad-libbing in the dance rager sections, where it's kind of a backwards and forwards vocal panning thing. I think also works quite well. So a very dynamic vocal performance, I would say, as well. So this track is basically everything you could want, like multifaceted, fantastic instrumental, plenty of ground covered, very ethereal, very dramatic, very fun, very lively. The vocals are incredibly intricate and very vulnerable, very emotional, very multifaceted, very characterful, very nice. The lyrics are some of the most self-aware I've heard from a Gorillaz track ever, all working to great effect, and I thought this was an absolutely brilliant track. And the final track is called Possession Island featuring Beck, who had a feature on the Song Machine project that was pretty decent, all things considered. So, you know, I was thinking like, hey, this is great, you know, let's go for it, because obviously, you know, given the names associated and how good the last feature was, I was expecting this to be similar. But unfortunately, I kind of ended up a little bit mixed on this one, because the sonic palette of this track is very, very quaint, to the point where it's almost kind of like a bit of a lullaby vibe, which I know is nothing that any band really ever wants to be associated with, but I feel like it does that quite well. Like the sound of the xylophones combined with these really quaint plucked acoustic guitars, the atmospheres, the strings, it's all very, very quaint, very airy, very atmospheric, but it works quite well. Again, it's maybe a little bit too quaint, and so kind of verges on being like a little bit sickly for that reason, but I feel like for all intents and purposes, the vibe it was going for was accomplished fairly well, and that's kind of brought home by the vocals, which again are very hushed, very subdued, but still with a melodic strength to them, a sense of vulnerability and emotion to them as well, which seems to be the hallmarks that basically every single performance on this entire album has had to it. And I think it's achieved here as well, albeit in a slightly different context, and maybe, you know, it doesn't hit quite as hard just because of how, like, I don't know how to say it, but because of how like subdued and how minimal and how quaint this track is, obviously nothing hits as hard, and so maybe the strength of the vocal performance can become slightly lost on me, but I think that's more just to do with like the sound of the track in general. I don't know. Anyway, I think the sound of the track works fairly well. The vocal performances are fairly decent throughout, and I feel like it kind of reminded me of some of the more vocal-centric older pop music. I'm thinking maybe stuff like the Everly Brothers, for instance, was the first thing that came to my mind. And again, maybe like Oil with Stevie Nicks, you expected Beck's contributions to be a bit more substantial than just like some backing vocals on the chorus, but I feel like his performance is fairly decent, although in contrast with the Stevie Nicks opinion, I have to kind of agree here. Like, you can barely tell it's Beck sometimes singing. Like, I wish it was maybe like Damon did a verse, Beck did a verse, rather than like Beck does some backing vocals to the point where you can't even tell that it's him sometimes. And I feel like the lyrics as well are kind of inscrutable because they seem to be covering a lot of ground, or like multiple bits of ground that don't seem to really connect with each other. Like, it goes from kind of, talking about the breakup of a relationship over social media, again kind of covering the album's central themes. The lyrics that led to that were kind of, when I went to California I died at the hands of the ghosting queen. Again, maybe an instance where the imagery is maybe a bit more in your face and so doesn't come across quite as effectively, but it covers that ground, fairly alright. But then you go from that to what I presume to be the kind of ending grand statement of the album, kind of, we're all in this together till the end, the camaraderie statement, like, the world's going to shit, but we're all in the same boat at least, which, I mean, I guess is fine, but like, listen, right? If this album has been defined by absolutely anything, it is that it takes subject matter that, if done by nearly anybody else, would sound like absolute horse shit, and turning them into halfway decent songs, like, songs about social media addiction, hyper reality, blah blah blah, all of this stuff, right? So you do all this in a fairly decent way, right? In a way that can very rarely be critiqued, apart from some of the imagery being a little bit on the nose on some tracks, and you decide to end it with like the most basic, like, apocalyptic platitude ever, like, we're all in this together, it feels very inconsequential as opposed to literally everything else, and so as an ending statement feels quite weak. Add to that the fact that in the bridge you get this weird mariachi band section that doesn't sound that good at all really, and doesn't fit with anything that comes in the track before or after it, which, it just kind of comes out of nowhere, happens for a bit and then leaves, and then it goes back to the kind of lullaby thing, literally fits with nothing. And so you end up with a track that, while there is some good stuff about it, like the quaint vibe of it works well, the interplay between Beck and Damon's alright, but it just feels really all over the place. And so, I came out of this one very mixed, which is a shame for a closer on such a strong album.
Where things they don't exist, and we're all in this together till the end, till the end.
So, what did I think of Gorillaz' brand new album, Cracker Island? Well, what I'll say, I'll answer this question straight away. Is it as good as Song Machine? I'm going to say no, because I think it would have been very, very difficult to scale the heights that Song Machine did, be it, this really big, massive conceptual thing, tons and tons of really well-renowned guests. I just think it would have been very, very difficult to follow that up with, like, a better or even an as good as album. But I feel like, Damon, Greg, Remy and company all did basically as good a job as they could to create a straightforward album. Like, put it this way, right? If you compare this album to other albums that I would say that are like it in terms of its structure, like The Fall or the Now Now, this one absolutely wipes the floor with both of them, no questions asked. Like, it's colourful, it's bright, it's well written, it's kaleidoscopic, subtly melancholic and dystopian as well, all does so quite well. Again, the lyrics that it tackles throughout this album, as dog shit as they could have been in any other context, they're actually done fairly well here. Maybe there were some tracks that just didn't hit as hard as others that I had some quibbles with, because a lot of this, I think the problem with albums like this, where you get some really, really strong material and maybe a bit of weaker material, is that because the strong stuff is so strong, the weaker stuff stands out a lot more, which I think, at least in part, is the case for this album, because there is some seriously strong stuff on this album. Again, I think as far as straight ahead albums for Gorillaz go in recent times, this is easily the best, but there are definitely some weaker moments here, although I would say that the weaker moments don't take away from the stronger moments by any means. So it's still a very strong release for Gorillaz. Not quite as strong as Song Machine. I would say that they've actually got quite a way to go, or maybe not as much a way to go as I'm making out, but there is definitely a palpable difference, but still a very strong release nonetheless. So I've had to give a score, I'd say maybe like a strong 7 light 8. Like, again, a very strong album, not as strong as Song Machine conceptually or lyrically or maybe musically, but still very, very strong, just with a few weaker moments that stand out all the more because of the strength of the other material here. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do consider liking and subscribing. It would really mean a lot to me. I'm going to keep this one brief, right? There are 2 more album reviews, hopefully, coming out within the next week, so look forward to that. And then I believe we've got 2 more releases coming out this Friday as I'm recording this, March 10th, so look out for them. A load of releases in March, actually. You've got 2 album reviews releasing in the next week. There's also 2 releases releasing on March the 10th, one on March the 24th, I believe, but also there is a big video in the works, an actual substantial piece of content coming from me very, very soon. It's an idea that I've been kind of gestating on since the channel's inception, really, and I've finally kind of got a handle around how to approach it in the way that I want to. So I'm going to start work on that, and hopefully you'll see that maybe by the end of April is what I'm going to say. That should be a really good piece of content. I might even try. I'll try and get it done as soon as I can, in as good a fashion as I can. But this video, you'll see, is quite important to me. Like, I really, really want to get this video right. So I've got the idea. I know exactly how to approach it. I'm going to start working on it. It will be out at some point very, very soon. Hopefully you enjoy it, because I admit there's been a lack of like op-ed style content recently, so this will hopefully make up for that. Tons of album reviews coming in the foreseeable future, the near future, and until then, I will see you all later.